the only fields that are standing, the only ground that you can work and get out onto are those that are regenerative.
Those are the powerful words of our guest of today, Anastasia, CEO and founder of Regrow. Regenerative agriculture really, really works. The data shows that the ability to plant, to harvest, to withstand the weather shocks, once in a 50-year droughts and floods happening every year, anyone, correlates very nicely with regenerative agriculture practices. To enable this at scale, MRVs are crucial, and Regrow just made another acquisition. So we check in with this MRV pioneer and successful entrepreneur why they are merging with the leading LATAM player. Last time we talked 5 years ago, they also just merged. We talk about the current state of MRV, who's paying, who isn't, who's doubling down on remote sensing, and who is investing in resilient agriculture. And what do the current wars everywhere, we are recording this in the middle of March 26, when the Iran war is in full swing, mean for resilient agriculture and the investments needed to unlock this? We talked, just as we did 5 years ago, about fertilizer and the double role it plays. In the global north, we can easily, I'm not saying it's easy, cut 70%, yes, you heard it right, 70, without meaningful yield drops. But in the global south, it's often desperately needed in many places, and with the current prices, it's going to be unaffordable. They're exploding, and the energy costs make it very, very difficult to produce and to even get it somewhere. And we talk AI and its ability to unlock the insights from large and cleaned up data sets, and why she's stepping into a more living systems thinking and is very optimistic about watershed scale regeneration is almost, really almost, at our fingertips. Enjoy. AI for Soil Health is funded by the European Union and has received funds from the UK Research and Innovation under the UK government's Horizon Europe funding guarantee. For more information, visit aiforsoilhealth.eu or find the link below. This is the Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food podcast, where we learn more on how to put money to work to regenerate soil, people, local communities, and ecosystems, while making an appropriate and fair return. Welcome to another episode today with an AI-powered platform to make agriculture resilient. Welcome back, Anastasia.
Thank you so much, Cody, for having me. It's incredible to be back after so long.
Yeah, it's been, I checked, 5 years. So at the end of March 21, we talked, and already, I don't think that the AI was already part of it, but wasn't so prominent. Of course, now we live in AI land. But definitely the resilient part was absolutely part of the conversation, was part of the website, was part of the, let's say, the language you've been using for a long time. And I think many people are starting to catch up on that a bit. We're recording this in the middle of a very disruptive war in the Middle East and many other places. And so we'll definitely touch upon that from a fertilizer perspective, which you mentioned last time quite a few times, and from just a resilience and dependency and a freedom perspective as well. So, but first of all, just welcome back on the podcast. You're still around as a company, which is not an easy thing, actually. And you are calling in actually with a very specific, exciting news as well. So let's start with that. What brings you on now? We could have recorded this check-in also in a couple of months, but actually the timing is very relevant. What's happening at Regrow and why is it so relevant to be back on the podcast at the moment?
Yes, really excited to share some news. We have been looking at the M&A space for the last 9 months. I've reflected on that earlier today in preparation for our conversation today. Pretty much since early summer last year, 2025, we started looking at opportunities for inorganic growth, recognizing that the way that markets are shifting and bringing a lot of uncertainty pushes companies to think differently about their growth. And we are at a point where we are happy to announce a merger with a company that we're very excited to partner with. It's with Platform Puma, and the company does MRV in similar ways to Regrow, but it has a very similar DNA, but has come up with different complementary products. So we're very proud to bring Latin American market leader into the Regrow family to cover global supply chains, especially as Latin America becomes more and more important as a supply and sourcing region for a lot of European companies that are driving the agenda around sustainability and resilience. On top of that, we're adding coverage for biofuel verticals, which is also growing in its importance. At Regrow, we had some fundamental quantification through the DNTC model that we use into biofuels, but Puma extends it. And another extension that we're really excited about is the extension to livestock. So again, Regrow has a few projects in livestock and our IP and modeling, but it's great to have a platform that enables the farmer transition and inclusion of livestock back on the land to be available. And we're looking forward to integrating the companies, integrating the teams, and offering this solution to our global group of customers, which some of them are already shared. So this merger really felt like it was on the cards for the customers, for the universe, and for ourselves.
And do you see that as a you said I started reflecting about 6 months ago into let's in the summer and starting to see what were signals for that. I think we've seen some interesting movements in the space in general, MRV space specifically as well. There are some customers really doubling down and some others, I don't know, quote unquote tourists leaving. There's a lot of flux. What triggered for you that reflection in the summer? What was something you thought, okay, let's see where we're going, and are there ways to partner, emerge, and do some acquisitions in this space to be in a better position? And maybe some other of the colleagues, let's say, are also looking to do that and not just all be by yourself. Like what triggered that sort of reflection period over the summer?
So it's not a secret that at the beginning of last year, US has shifted its position on investment into sustainability and resilience, as well as put a lot of focus on international trade through revision of the tariffs. And so a lot of the companies were in that turmoil that followed for 6 to 9 months. As a result, the attention was drawn away from investment in the core resilience of supply chains on the farm level. Some companies stayed, and some companies stayed and double down, while some others, companies and teams, like you said, maybe pulled back or put it on the slow burner on the cooktop. And for us, what that meant when we were looking at our P&L, when we are looking at our impact metrics, we're a B Corp, it's really important for us to continue to facilitate the change we want to see in the world. It's in our mission statement, transition agricultural acres towards resilience. When we were reflecting on what is growing and what is working, we saw that the projects that already had a strong base and very strong commitments from off-takers were continuing to grow. Maybe they were growing less aggressively than we would have hoped or expected, but they were still growing. And so our realization from that observation was that in acquiring a growth base that already is established in a different region, we can accelerate this a creative return on investments into our platform and science because MRV in our vision needs to be a standard, ideally a global standard. Maybe there's a couple of providers, but ultimately we're getting to a point where we will have clarity on MRV standards in the same way that there's gap accounting and other types of accounting around the world. Everyone knows how to read a cash flow model when it gets sent to you, when it's in that accounting standard. And so similarly, we believe in that future for the MRV. In order to actually implement it, we need to add coverage in geographies where we currently either are slowly developing and need acceleration or are not able to penetrate due to local specifics. I'm European, but I went to Latin America first time earlier this year. Bill, my co-founder, through our previous M&A activity, he has been trying to develop business in Brazil, and those relationships academically, they're fantastic, but commercially, it has been relatively slow. I want to be transparent, as I usually am. And we saw an opportunity that instead of slowly continuing to do what we've been trying to do and develop it from afar, what's the opportunity to partner with a local leader that wants to grow and has the same aspirations, has the same mission and values around the customer satisfaction, the farmer success, the supply chain focus, and resilience as an outcome. All of those points really brought us into the evaluation of a number of companies globally. It wasn't just Latin America that we started to look at. Well, we looked at a number of small organizations, large organizations, and any investment banker can tell you how to run that type of M&A process. It's like a CRM. You create a list of companies that could be good targets. You start talking to them and to the network to understand what could be a good fit. And we had a couple of conversations that terminated in different stages. We've gone down this path with a few companies to try to evaluate if it's a good fit commercially, if there are synergies operationally, if there are synergies in investment-wise, return on investment. And we saw the most empowering synergies for both sides to be with Puma, and that's how we landed on this partnership that we're so excited about.
And now coming to the current turmoil we're in or the current without saying "I told you so," which you for sure you're internally are saying a few times. Have people been knocking on your door, or we're still in the middle of the shock, basically, of fertilizer pricing going absolutely through the roof. We don't know how long that's going to stay. Nobody knows. When you're listening to this, it might be very different. But imagine we're recording this in the middle of March, 2026, and it's definitely crisis in many ways. What the last years with the push, with the pullback from the US for not focusing on sustainability necessarily anymore, and you've been always saying resilience is the word to drive. Have you seen, let me ask a question differently. What is different 5 years ago to now in terms of customers that were, who's buying, who stopped buying maybe? What are the most interesting ways? We talked a lot about water last time as well and fertilizer. Like, where are the most important pieces of your work, let's say, and what is really starting to develop further, and what maybe hasn't so much as we hope to, biodiversity credits or something like what hasn't really taken off. So what's been taking off over the last 5 years? And then we get also in today, maybe that's a bit too fresh, yes, but we'll see where we go with that. So what has been working well and what hasn't so much, let's say, in the last 5 years?
What has worked phenomenally well is the global alignment around the TCO2e as a metric, so total tons of carbon equivalent that are sequestered or abated. That to me is truly phenomenal, given how complex this matter is. And we're recording this on the coattails of the release of LSRS now as a standard, not as a guidance that encourages everybody to start looking at removals. And that was
For a
truly.
layman, if you walk us through that in a few sentences, what should we know or what should we recognize before we all start Googling or Geminiing or chatting? Yeah.
That's right. Well, effectively, companies were leaving out the portion of soil organic carbon impact from the projects that they were funding because there was weak or unclear guidance around how to actually account for that. Now that we have much clearer guidance, it's still not done, but I'm very grateful where they've gotten it to already. For a number of projects is completely game changing because maybe if you're in grassland ranching, those are the only things that you can really prove and scale. We have also now more opportunities to do it. So it's not just through direct sampling, which is, of course, is a good tool at a right scale. At a huge scale, it's not possible to soil sample every single hectare. And so what you're starting to do is measure and model, and that starts being cost effective, scalable, and scientifically viable to fund projects on the basis of a more comprehensive outcomes. And of course, this is what's the driver for the farmer as well. They want to make sure that the soil can grow back effectively and regenerate itself. And you can see it when the farm transitions to regenerative. You can put in the shovel and or do it with the machinery so you can get more soil out, but you can see the top layers completely change, the infiltration rate being completely different. And as you were saying, nutrient demand, so nitrogen it being completely different, and you're starting to get off the treadmill every year you implement regenerative. What have we seen also working is the recognition of MRV. To me, I was hoping this would be the case, but the fact that this acronym is used by governments all around the world in facilitating the ecosystem service markets is very promising. We're not the first ones in kind of the small category that we're building in agriculture and food. We're not the first ones in the world to use the concept of MRV. It was used as NV in energy space before because we're a lot clearer in how to do it in a building because it's a built environment. We can measure things. It's understandable. It's not quite as directly impacted as nature based environment, such as a farm. So those are the things that I think, looking back at 5 years ago, I was hoping that they would happen, but they actually did happen and in a big way. What also happened halfway through this period, almost now, or in a tail end of this period, is that a number of folks that were thinking this was promising but weren't quite committed to it long term, or weren't quite focused or reached enough scale, actually are starting to fizzle out. And as you started in the episode, it actually is pretty tough to have your startup get to now almost 10 years, and more than 6 months will be 10, and that is a huge milestone. And since the beginning, since the founding of the company, I have kept saying that in 2027 we will be inevitable because I believe that is close enough to 2030. And if we survived that long and that far, we have come. We have the platform that's steady, the customers that are supporting this, and we've built scale. Ultimately, that's partly what M&A is about, getting to scale where we can do this so operationally efficiently because we have all the projects that are consistent enough with all the quantification is consistent enough. Now, to your other question, what has not been working as well? There are only a few countries where you can actually issue water credits and biodiversity credits according to schemes that are recognized by the government, which really is fundamental. The regulation should be seen as an enabler, and private industry says it all the time. I was in two very high profile industry meetings this week and last week, and industries across the board are saying we want regulation because we want clarity on how to invest in something, and nature and water need it pretty badly. If you look at the UK, this is a space in which you have regulatory framework, that you have guidance to be 10% nature positive on every project that gets built. And so the farmer can actually participate in the economy that's boosted by it to plant biodiversity zones like pollinator habitats or to restore wetlands. And it's hugely beneficial to our ecosystem in a number of ways. But do we see that market globally expanded? It's starting in Europe, but we still do not have full alignment on neither the regulatory space nor the metrics. So I'm encouraged where we've gotten to with carbon, with now CRCF in Europe, trying to bring even more structure to it and more validity. But I think the same needs to happen for water and nature because there is clear path to doing it scientifically, to quantification of it. But if there's no alignment in the industry around what metrics we're using, then it's much harder to scale economically. If we use just one metric for carbon, and sure, we can break it down into all the different gases and removals and reductions and all of that technical jargon that is important for climate, but big picture consumer interest needs to be just trending in the right direction. When you look at water and biodiversity, there is no consistency. Are you counting turtles on the island? Are you counting birds? Are you doing DNA samples of the topsoil? Well, what about water? There's so many different metrics as well. I'll pause here. I am very much looking forward to that alignment because I think that can bring more holistic investment into the space. And I'll leave the things I'm really excited about for your later question.
Oh, I think. Wait 1 second. There's a headphones that came into mine. I should be back. Can you still hear me?
Okay. Yeah, I hear you well. Ooh, it's not in the headphones because
Oh
I
no, it's
hear
not
the
the headphones. Now
feedback.
it's back. Yeah,
Okay,
my
1, 2, 3.
headphones switched on in another room and took me over.
Mhm.
Let me just make sure that these settings are back to where they should be. Yes, they are. And bring us back to the current. I have questions about M&A as well, but I was just thinking it's super fresh. I don't know how much you thought about it, but the current disrupting or disruptions we see with potential future ones. I think if we are fair, I think in this 5 year period, we had a Suez Canal blockage by accident, but it showed us fragility. We, of course, had a war or have a war in Ukraine, which sent up prices, but not even as much as now here. There's a lot of things have happened in 5 years, and let's hope that doesn't happen in the next five, but chances are they will because we live in a very
Yeah.
fragile polycrisis world. What are your views on that, specifically on agriculture and food? Is that starting to make people lean into resilience in a different way that we've seen, like a nice to have? No, it's actually fundamental. Is there a tone change? Have you sensed a tone change in all the meetings you're in, the high profile ones you're meeting, also in general with customers, with clients, with farmers, that, oh, this is maybe the new normal, unfortunately?
I think there's a couple of aspects here that are a little bit hard for the industry to reconcile. So I would give you a couple of examples of what's actually happening. So we might not be thinking about it too much, but part of crops that we're growing goes to fish feed and making sure we have alternative sources of protein because the modern consumer understands that conventional farming of in protein systems is particularly troubling unless it's certified and clear and transparent. And so the modern consumer is actively moving away from red meat and meat sources of protein towards fish and seafood. And what we're seeing there, that the global suppliers are actually pretty impacted by the Suez Canal blockage because you really need to ship something from India all the way around Africa into Europe? And how will that impact the consumer, given that the processor now needs to pay a much higher price for transportation for no fault of its own, for completely force majeure as far as his contract is concerned, but yet they will have to absorb that margin because we want to protect the consumer. But I think at some point you start actually pointing the consumer to it so that the consumer can get more educated around why it's not only really important to a trend that we're seeing to support local because you have much less supply chain disruption if all of it is local. In many cases, it's important to start getting informed and actually understand and look into the impact of climate change and global disruptions on the food system. There's only a few there are only a few studies globally that actually demonstrate the linkage, and there was one in the UK. But usually these numbers are heavily abstracted, and so we're doing ourselves in a way a disservice. So we have a machine that's supporting us, and it looks like subsidies, and it makes sure that even if there is a loss of agricultural productivity, the farmers are supported, and then we actually have to buy the commodity elsewhere. But food companies and traders and processors deal with that right now and have to absorb it. We still see the final outcome of it, the rising food prices, the rising commodity prices, but we're not linking it directly. And what's challenging with the political will and the window of political action is to thread the needle on initiatives that have longer term value. And I see more of that will in Europe to think beyond just the 5 years of electorate and think a bit more generationally and working hard to align the industry and the public finance together with private and philanthropic sector. Everyone wants the same thing. Ultimately, resilience, why is it so important? Just a quick cameo for that really important concept is that currently we're paying almost an insurance payout for something that's not working in agriculture. And so the farmers that do not want to depend as much on subsidies or insurance or cannot access it are actually a lot more willing and able to transition to regenerative agriculture because they feel there is a need to do so. And it looks very different in different regions around the world, as I'm sure the listeners know. They've been with us for over 5 years. We've been talking about. But when you look at the concept of resilience, truly, what do we want as society? We want to have access to healthy, nutritious food that comes from healthy, nutritious, ideally well-grown ingredients that are also good for the planet. And all of those actually stack really well. Regenerative is healthier for the planet and for the human gut, more nutritious, but we're still trapped in a system that is paying for conventional farming to be incentivized in some countries so incentivized that they are unable to transition to
Hmm.
regenerative. They're willing, they're interested, but realistically the financial system currently doesn't support them. Like federal crop insurance in the US needs a reform to be able to align the public dollar with the outcome that's good for the farmer and for the planet. At Regrow, we've looked at so much data over the years. It's country by country now. It's every year is a 50-year event. Just think about
Yeah.
that. The last 6 years, every year we have an event that has a probability of 1 in 50 years, and it's a flood or a drought or a
Or
prolonged
both. Yeah.
period or both. And the only fields that are standing, the only ground that you can work and get out onto are those that are regenerative. And so if we're
That notion,
starting
but that
to
notion,
unpack,
just to come back to that notion, I think hasn't landed with so many yet. Like we still have that. Does this stuff actually work? Conversation quite a lot, like surprisingly a lot. And you're saying with the data, with the work you do with clients, that's the only fields that you can get into as quickly as you need. The only stuff you can harvest in these 50-year events that happen every year are regenerative. On
that's
whatever
right.
spectrum, we can have an
It's a
endless.
huge probability of regenerative practice to ability to withstand those events with high yield stability, call it yield resilience, or the ability to plant to begin with, because with these increased floods, you get prevent plant, you cannot get out onto the ground and work it.
Which is was were you that confident 5 years ago of that data? Or
Well, Bill's side of the company, when we were merging in 2021 and announcing it, they had some studies because in 2019, this massive US flood, and I was actually going through it like physically. I was on the bus with the Australian trade delegation. We were in the Midwest, several feet in water in our bus. We
which must
actually
be an
saw
interesting
huge
experience
correlation.
because that Like
Absolutely.
Australia
I was like right
came
there.
to see how it's done, let's say, and you were sharing, okay, this is not necessarily how it's done, but there's a field that's very interesting. This is how it could be done.
That's right. It seems like it's working somewhere, but why is it not working over there? And when you look back from that time, you see the practice adoption and correlation with the ability to
Grow.
withstand these shocks. And the data has been pretty clear since 2019. So my big picture summarizing comment on resilience and the shock absorption of the system was going to be that the reason why we're not adapting as quickly is because there's a whole system that's
Mm.
supporting the common, generally adopted way of doing things that we need to transition because it becomes financially non-viable. And when you are looking at true resilience on the ground, now we don't have to talk to everybody about 2019 flood in the US whilst they're sitting in the UK. I was in the UK yesterday and I was telling them about what happened to them because every single year I can pick an event. Let's look at your drought last year, and that was the most dismal, atrocious harvest, lowest on record in 86 years. And here are the fields that did not have that issue. Let's look at the year before when you had flood and 10% of wheat was not able to get planted, and all of the industry and other on effects in the supply chain that led to. Now, unfortunately, due to Polycrisis, I do not have to look that far to point someone to the data. And we actually work very hard with regulators and NGOs to share our data at an aggregate scale without exposing anybody, without showing exact farms at the county levels, at the watershed levels to policymakers to help them drive the decisions and drive alignment because facts can speak for themselves in these maps.
And which actually brings up a question on the open sourceness, that's not a word, but I made it up, of this data. Like, how far do you go to drive that? Of course, not revealing anything, but there is, regulators might also want to see, actually, we would love to see who is contributing the most to this flood, or let's say which farms or which places within the watershed should we intervene first? Like, where do you draw that line? Of course, it depends. But like in terms of, okay, we have this data, a lot of this remote sensing data. We talked about it a lot last time. You're fighting the clouds, but you can go through radar. There are some more commercial satellites you have to pay more for. There's quite a few open ones, so you're stacking together all different layers. So where does it stop in that sense of privacy and open sourceness? When can farmers do themselves? Actually, I would like to see my field compared to the neighbor. What's that relationship with data and privacy and open source?
Yeah, so I believe we had a very healthy relationship with privacy and open source that still enables us to be the business that wants to see
Because you are a business,
itself
yeah. You have to be. Yeah.
be the change that it wants to be. Because fundamentally, our theory of change is that if we're able to unlock by accessing them through measurement, the incentive for every part of the supply chain, then each part will evolve in a way that plays its corresponding role in transitioning us to resilience. That's what we truly believe in. That's why we stay in our lane, being an MRV, being the supporting partner, being an expert that coaches folks on how to do it, and the one that comes with the data and tries to help build ROI models in these stories as to why it matters. So because we're dealing with so much geospatial data, trillions, we monitor now 52% of the world arable land. It's over 1.5 billion acres, which is staggering numbers compared to what I would have thought we were capable of doing 5 years ago. Again, a lot of AI, and every year, some parts of the system get cheaper, some parts get more complex, and we continue to invest, but some parts of it get cheaper. And it's really encouraging to me because it means we'll be able to ultimately get to dismal cost of MRV and get this to every
Is
product
that
in every
something like the next
supermarket,
couple of
etc.
years? Do you see that accelerating, decelerating? Are you excited for if we have this conversation in 2, 3 years, would it be another jump like that?
I believe so. Even what we've seen in the last 4 months with
Wow.
the releases of the recent AI models, what they enable us to do, and how much faster they're enabling us to draw insights from our data. This has never been so accessible and so informative because we've worked so hard to make sure the data is good, and we're continue to work, and nothing's perfect. Every company, and ours too, we make mistakes. We tell customers when we do, we have to make good and make sure that the climate impact is trending in the right direction with every action we take. But I think as a business, as a CEO of a baby business that is trying to contribute to a massive industry much larger than itself, we have the responsibility to make sure it's at all times financially viable. And to me, this transformation is extremely exciting, and that's what partly enables these strategic partnerships and M&A, because we're now able to bring the technology to more places faster by leveraging AI. Yeah, I think in the next 2, 3 years, you and I can't even imagine what's going to happen if you can structure and enable that data access into the right place. But back to your question about data privacy and data exposure. So we do not have information on who farms what land because we look at it from satellite pictures until the farmer comes and enrolls into one of the programs offered by our corporate partners
It says,
that
"Here am
uses.
I. This is me." Yeah.
Yes, and says, here are my fields. I'm going to pick them on your map, and I'm going to tell you where you were maybe had low confidence, like you were saying, there were cloudy satellite pictures. You didn't know when I planted my cover crop in winter. I can tell you, here's my machinery file, and so on and so forth. That only happens when the farmer actually engages directly, and we really encourage them to because we're trying to bring incentives to them. That is the entire business model that we've established 5 years ago, that farmers, instead of paying for software and enrolling in it, can get the benefit of payments by providing some additional data that improves the quality of the model and drives a better outcome for them. Now, this data taken in aggregate and sliced in a much coarser spatial resolution. As I was saying, in the US, it could be HUCs, it could be counties and cantons and watersheds in Europe and in other places, regions, states, territories, you name it. Basically, it's a spatial resolution of a district that we consider to be consistent from climatic and soil and other parameters, that it's relevant to look at it together. I can tell you that level of resolution is screaming insights at you. If you see two neighboring districts and they perform very differently because of the policy, you will be able to see it so clearly on the map. So we clearly terraformed this place. It's not because farmers here feel the need to use more phosphorus. Well, we've actually incentivized these other farmers to cut their use of phosphorus, and look, they
They did.
actually are performing quite well. And it's important to not just look at the emissions profile, but also at the stability and productivity, because the food security issue will become more central. And maybe I was a little bit more veiled about it 5 years ago as a Ukrainian before the war that we have now. But now we're sitting here, we have three wars at the same time, the ones that are in the news all the time. There's also dozens that are not in the news
Mm.
all the time. And the fertilizer prices impact the people who are most dependent on them. So I'm concerned that it's going to impact Africa the
Mm.
most, because this is where fertilizer is imported. This is where it's needed the most to boost productivity, but it's not affordable anymore. So, what that's going to mean, because the farmers in the developed West can absolutely safely cut their use of synthetic nitrogen without much of the yield loss. And there's plenty of programs from commercial partners in the market to help
To
them
help them.
get on with this idea, whether it's yield warranties that the companies are starting to offer. It's very innovative. It's a fantastic structure. If people are interested, they can look into that. But when we're looking at policy decisions, they're glaring from this map back at you. And so obviously, we want to inform these decisions on how they're being made and taken. Or, for example, for the new scheme on CRCF, how will the baselines be decided? Is it really feasible that European Union, without use of satellite imagery, without use of AI, will have access to an up-to-date information on the practice adoption just by data collection through the subsidy scheme? That potentially is insufficient. In my view, it's also inefficient. And so if you can be smarter at closing the loop, ultimately we are using ESA data from Copernicus program to
Which are both
fuel
European programs.
a
Yeah.
lot of
Yeah.
these insights, can do the full circle value creation attribution. And I'm hoping that's where the European Space Agency and European Commission will go with it, because we need a pulse on the planet. It's literally on fire. It's overheating, overflooding. There are challenges, but there are also solutions, and we can see them. And hence, if we can adopt them, we'll be more efficient with public finance, Of course, then there'll still be problems of adoption and having us all in one room to agree. It's never easy, but humanity can do it. I have faith.
And it's interesting you mentioned specifically on in Africa, we hear already stories from Million Belay. We had on the podcast, we're doing a full Africa series at the moment of fertilizer prices in general, I think are like 3x in landlocked countries in Africa, Uganda, etc. And if you even get it, and last time we noticed with the attack on Ukraine, in Ukraine, the prices spiked and even were cancelled. Like fertilizer won't find its way to Pakistan and to other places because other countries are just buying it. So even I just had a farmer on this morning and saying if you can even get it, there's a question of payment if you have the money, which many people don't, and then even the question if ever gets delivered. So we were being pushed into an extreme situation there as well. But in at least the global north, we have a lot of programs. We can safely cut. We're over applying everywhere. Most people, not everyone, don't send me angry messages now. But you can safely cut, I think, 30-40%. And there are a lot of programs to push that down way further. If you look at ARA reports, I think most of their farmers had a 70-80% reduction. And if you do that in a managed way, it's probably very resilient. Like it helps your resilience a lot. But we shouldn't forget.
In on this point that you just mentioned because we've done the modeling at the very beginning of the company, so 9.5 years ago, that we saw those figures of up to 80% reduction. And I'm so pleased with the work that EARA and the generous funders that are supporting that work. We're hoping to support future reports to actually scale things as well there. But it's true, like we're seeing it first scientifically in trials and maybe in smaller samples, and then we're seeing it at scale takes almost 10 years for us to get on with something that's a fact. And I'm glad that regenerative and carbon markets took only 5 years in the recent iteration. I'm not discounting by any means the work of everybody who worked for the previous 15 years on making them a staple. But I think the global poly crisis will actually help us with the adoption, as gruesome as it sounds.
Yeah, actually, it was going to be a question. What do you think? Will this it's so difficult to look at or to predict, but will this accelerate adoption of a lot of these practices, policies, hopefully looking for ways to cut subsidies, to cut emergency spending on this, to cut fertilizer, and to cut a lot of the chemicals that are made with natural gas? All these prices are going to go through the roof. And to look at food security, which is an interesting double. At least there's research now. We can point that, look, there are pathways. And you have the polycrisis of climate and weather, which doesn't help with production. Are they knocking on the door already? Do you see any responses, or is that too early and too fresh, at least in this war that just started?
I would say generally the response takes 3 to 6 to 9 months to go through the
Like last time when
system to
Trump came on
actually
board,
make
and yeah, you saw the same. There's a delay.
the
Yeah,
investments. Exactly. It takes a moment, but every time we experience a step change in the right direction, it's almost like we are not unknowing what we already know. And so I'm really hopeful the way that we cannot now unknow that agriculture is a meaning right now and can sequester carbon and can reduce nitrogen. This is becoming a point of general realization and common sense. The fact, like you were saying, we are getting to a place where I can stand in front of an audience of asset managers like last week with you there and present the data that is talking about the correlation between regenerative adoption and returns. And that is something that they started understanding. Even the phrase that came up that extremely encouraged me, and it's very asset management language, but it's perfect. Conventional farm will likely become a stranded asset, especially if it's dependent on synthetic fertilizer. And that is brilliant. That's ultimately something that we need to see happen, and different countries have different dynamics with land management, land
of course.
ownership, leasing, etc. Of course, there's a lot of complexity to that, but people do see value in land, want to continue to invest. There's good benchmarks on what the land investment creates, and land managers are more and more often sought in order to manage the land through the regenerative transition. And so I maybe don't see it at 100%, but I see the leaning of the financial community and asset management
Hmm.
towards it. I think we'll start hearing a lot about food security. We already have a huge push for local food from consumers that have the disposable income and can make that
And time.
choice.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And so I think the more we're seeing the disruption and the supply chain disruptions result in price tag changes on shelves, the more a consumer will be aware, the more political contingency will have to talk about it, and the more they'll hopefully have to do about it. I also want to throw in something that's a little bit unconventional. So, with the new sources of energy and our breakthroughs in harnessing renewables, there's actually potential for Africa to have independent sources of green urea and fertilizer. And of course, those developments require
An interesting
patient
point.
capital,
Hmm.
but there are fantastic startups that are working on it. Not because I'm saying let's continue with the Haber-Bosch process, but because we actually have to have support where people otherwise would not be able to grow food, and more than 2 billion people on a day-to-day basis are surviving due to that process alone, and that's not an insignificant number given there's 7 of us, 7 billion altogether. So I think the transition is gradual, and phases of transition for the West and other regions may look differently, but we should be seeing the trends towards national independence, more supply chain localization, and pullback on that national supply. There's going to be a series of supply chains that cannot do that, where it's simply non-viable, that will start the conversation about food security in a sensible policy manner where the investments have to be reinvestment vehicles around regulatory incentives need to be retooled in order to actually foster food security and not only just environmental benefits alone. It has to come hand in hand as demonstrated that it can be. And finally, we will see more actors. This is something that I'm very encouraged by already, that we're not just seeing food companies and processors and those directly involved in the supply chain coming to this table and engaging, but more banks, more landowners, asset managers, maybe even finally, let's not wait 5 years for that, insurance companies.
The holy grail is always the insurance company. In the health discussion, it's the insurance. But they're picking up the bills of
Yes,
many of these things, and they've
exactly.
been looking around. We know they come to our events like RFSI. They've been making investments left and right, and there's a huge pot of money that needs to be invested, and that needs to be invested in a way that makes sense for a future world to still pay insurance premiums, and their payouts are going through the roof if they're directly exposed to extreme weather, and they're just pulling out of regions and places. So there's a very interesting, we should do a whole series probably on that. The other point you mentioned, super interesting,
Indeed.
renewable energy, the last 5 years have just continued to plummet. The cost of that, the deployment cost, for anybody that hasn't really kept up with solar prices, for instance, and the revolution happening in East Africa with electric mobility as well. Pakistan is through the roof in terms of, actually literally on the roof in terms of solar, completely under the radar. I didn't make that pun intended, but follow some of that
Was a
exponential
good
deep
one.
tech on solar, because we might be in a position relatively soon where we're going to, and already in some places, what do we do with all the solar between 12 and 3? There are curtailments, like you produce more and you can't really sell it. Are we going to produce our own urea? Are we going to freeze it? Are we
Absolutely.
going to run a data center? Are we going to
You're
charge a
absolutely right. Do you
tractor? Are
use
we
that
going to,
energy
it's
to
solar energy.
produce something like green ammonia? Do you use the energy for some other intensive purposes? Do you have the power in and the capacity to do that? But definitely, countries in Asia also speaking about compute as
Of
an
course.
export. So, for example, if it's a lot cheaper for you to run loads in a data center at that time, do we render all the movies at that time or do something else that's compute intensive? It's really being thought about as an opportunity for export, given that the energy transformation with renewables now unlocks this capacity. Yeah,
Which, and I didn't think, I thought, I've heard some farmers talk about it, I think, in the Netherlands, but the costs were still too much. But it's going to be very soon, that's no longer going to be an issue. And we're going to think, yeah, what to do with that extra energy. I want to be conscious of your time as well and ask one final question. What have you changed your mind about in the last 5 years? What has been really like, okay, I was quite on that bandwagon, but actually doesn't work, doesn't happen, or maybe something I'm actually super convinced about X, Y, Z now compared to 5 years ago. Because it's nice. We talked about like at the beginning of the company, like in the middle of the company, now we're at 10 years. And I'm not saying we should wait another 5, but it's a nice rhythm in that sense. You're almost 10.
Absolutely. Okay, you will get a little confession from me. So this realization only happened late last year after we've celebrated 9. And maybe this is going to be embarrassing for me to listen to in 3 to 5 years when we do another episode, given just for listeners, Cohen and I do talk to each other more often, but apparently Regrow goes through these important cycles that we need to update everybody on 5 year
Mergers and
milestone
acquisitions, yeah.
trajectory. Yes, well, maybe I'm not going to wait that long
I
for
was going to ask,
leads.
are
Who
there on the
knows?
books? But that's maybe, I'm sure they are. It's an interesting landscape at the moment.
That's right. I hold your horses. But I would say my realization was that maybe as young and ambitious as I was when I started the business, I thought that by putting energy into it, almost not so handily because it's the entire company, but our team with our customers, we could move the needle so substantially. And I think we've achieved a lot because we've recruited the biggest names in the industry to work with us, and I think we've achieved a lot together. I don't think the recognition of Regen or MRV or Insights would have been where it's at without Regrow demonstrated global scalability and the corporate partnership around it. But that was like the main vehicle as a translation of our theory of change. Partner with corporates and supply chain and try to implement incentives because that will get the flywheel moving. That will start trickling the water onto the mill wheel. Now, what I think the next phase will look like, given it's a very clear 5 year cut from that merger to now, is actually working a lot more closely with the local communities because we've engaged the capital that is willing. I'm not saying there's not more capital than it's willing, but I think in 2 to 3 years, we will see a lot of companies getting off of their seats, getting up and starting to move forward because 2030 will be very close and the supply chain disruptions will cost them more and more every year. Whilst right now there may be funding a small project, there will be funding a much larger one. But just like what I said 5 years ago, I do have a lot more conviction in it now that landscape level action will actually be the next unlock that we need. And I'm finally starting to see that people do want the co-benefits, they do want to partner with local entities, and it's not just lip service, oh, we should partner and let's have this demagogy. This is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is when you exert all that energy for 10 years trying to change something that you think is good for the world and recruiting everybody in your path or trying to amass the followership, you then stop and realize that maybe there's a more efficient way of using your energy. And it is connecting the dots in the network in which things can flow more organically. And so to me, there's a bit of a shift into the living systems mindset that probably took me a very long time because things that I was doing, they were working. So I didn't change my mindset until they stopped working at the rate at which I wanted them to. And now I'm really excited about what that living systems mindset and finding our role in between communities and supply chain actors and folks that are financing the system. How can we unlock it? And it's an exploration, but I do believe there will be more landscape level collaborations that will come out of that. And we'll just continue to try to be in service of all of these projects, lowering the prices and improving the quality, and just keep on keeping on. We need to continue to invest in our own resilience so we can see the change we want to see.
Thank you so much. I don't think there's a better way to wrap this up. I don't think it's going to be another 5. Looking forward to checking on that specifically. I think landscape scale is and watershed, whatever bioregional, whatever term we want to give to it, is such an interesting path and such an under resourced, overlooked, neglected, any term you can come up with. It's such a big lever. So I'm very interested. We talked about it last time as well. So figuring out what to plant where and why, what to change in a landscape, what are the nodal points, where should we focus on, and we're very close. And if not, actually, we are there at a level we can start asking those questions and see, okay, these are the crucial points first, and then the next. Not that any farm is important, any piece of land is, but some are more urgent. With limited resources, we need to focus somewhere. And that's a system change and a living system mindset. And there's a lot happening on the ground, which we have to incorporate. And how do you supercharge that? I think is a very meaningful strategy. So thank you so much for coming on here to talk about some important news and general check-in. And thank you so much for the work you do.
Thank you, Cohen, for supporting us all and excited for the listeners to tell us what they thought, comments, thoughts, and keep up with us, guys. Connect with us online, and we're real people. We want to help. If you think you'd have a good use of that data that I kept talking about, please reach out. I hope there's a collaboration. You're part of the ecosystem. Let's be friends.
Thank you so much for listening all the way to the end. I'm very curious what you think of this one. We often use the words MRV, but don't really go into depth with an entrepreneur in that space. Also someone that really asks for more regulation or clearer regulation, let's say. Of course, we'll go deeper into that around carbon in our carbon series with OGCR. And really interesting to see that mergers and acquisitions are happening, and that even in all the noise about no sustainability, no focus on sustainability, and that's all outdated and blah, 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 that actually resilience is really driving a lot of these conversations, and groups that are exposed to that and are exposed to these extreme weather events are starting to do more, luckily. So it's encouraging to see. It's not an easy journey, almost 10 years in the 10-year overnight success, as they like to say. But I'm really interested to follow this. There's so much we can see from space and so much we can structure better in terms of incentives and on a watershed or landscape level to figure out where to intervene and where to incentivize farmers more to improve water quality and to really build a resilient agriculture system that can withstand these shocks. And I think the data she shared, it's very clear. Like I'm looking at the quote again, the only fields that are standing, the only grounds that you can work and get out onto are those that are regenerative. There's no word that we don't understand there. It's very clear. And I think that message has to land still. Today I was on LinkedIn and saw some comments, Regen Ag is BS and blah, blah, blah. Don't use the term. It doesn't mean anything. I guess those people have to catch up with science. Anastasia was saying since 2019, you can see a lot of this data and it just gets clearer. And yeah, it takes 5 to 10 years for the rest of the world to catch up. So let's hope we're close to that. I'm really curious what you thought of this episode. We recorded in the middle of the war, of one of the many, obviously, but the Iran war. So I don't know what happened, of course, when you listen to this, but it's definitely a very disruptive time in terms of fertilizer prices. Of course, all the lives affected, but just on the commodity side of fertilizer prices, of gas prices, energy prices. And I'm afraid it's going to stay with us for a bit. So I hope you're safe and when listening to this, and stay resilient, stay regenerative, and focus on soil. Let us know anything you want in the comments, on social media, through the website. We read everything, and yeah, let us know. And as always, thank you for listening, and hope to see you at the next one. This podcast is part of the AI for Soil Health project, which aims to help farmers and policymakers by providing new tools powered by AI to monitor and predict soil health across Europe. For more information, visit ai4soilhealth.eu or find the link below. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. For show notes and links discussed, check out our website, investinginregenerativeagriculture.com/posts. If you like this episode, why not share it with a friend? And get in touch with us on social media, our website, or via the Spotify app, and tell us what you liked most. And give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or your podcast player. That really, really helps us. Thanks again, and see you next time.